My name is Brent Sadler, a senior research fellow at the Heritage Foundation, where I cover a wide range of national security topics to include commercial shipping and shipbuilding. On August 12th, I was honored to spend several hours with Ambassador William Middendorf II, who worked for 3 presidents at the height of the Cold War and, importantly, to its successful conclusion. In this interview, there are many highlights, such as his tenure as ambassador to the Organization of American States, as Soviet and Cuban adventurism in the region was peaking, and his personal experiences in Cuba particularly are timely given events there today and in Venezuela. As a retired Navy man, I benefited from weapons and ships he ushered into service in the 1970s when he was Secretary of the Navy, like Ohio-class ballistic missile submarines or Aegis radar and combat control systems that remain the backbone of deterrence today, almost 50 years later. As such, it is important to memorialize the wisdom and insights of his 100 years, and I am sure you will not be disappointed on what he has to say.
Well, I can only cite the 5 or 6 examples you cited where I had first-hand knowledge of the communist takeovers and the 3 or 4 basic characteristics of each one. There were 3 highlights that stand out. One was the softening up of the population about the communists, and they called them land reformers and income redistributors and George Washingtons of the Caribbean or George Washingtons of the Pacific, or further, they were going to create democracy. They use that term democracy all the time, which meant whenever they use the term, it meant communism. And in the end, the 3 basic characteristics were, in each case, our own State Department was behind each of the 5 revolutions for different reasons. At the end of the World War II, the State Department was, of course, very much aligned with the Soviet Union in fighting Hitler, and the Soviet Union was very much behind Mao in China. Mao was disguised cleverly as George Washington of the Pacific by people like E.V. Snow, who wrote Red Star Over China in 1944, which formed American opinion about this romantic Mao who's going to bring out democracy, income redistribution, land reform, all the buzzwords that you hear, I heard in all 5 takeovers, which I witnessed very personally, as I'm about to describe. And I was in China with the occupation of China. My ship was brought in to Shanghai in 1945 for the occupation of China, and at the end of the war. And at that time, General George Marshall was sent by Harry S. Truman, President Truman, to China to deliberate between the Chiang Kai-shek's forces, which had been fighting communism and the Japanese for all those years, and the communists, Mao, and unfortunately, General Marshall was, who arrived on the 20th of December 1945. I was there, and we were all part of his anybody with a Jeep that could command a Jeep and a pistol was part of his security forces. It wasn't anything personal. So he arrived with great fanfare. It was going to deliberate between these two opposing forces. Chiang Kai-shek, who was trying to create a nationalist and hopefully free market country, and Mao, who was talking about bringing about democracy, translated communism, and he was going to bring about land reform and income redistribution, all of which fell on delicate ears of what Lenin used to describe as useful idiots. And in my experience in China, almost everyone that I talked to of the higher intellectual set were favorable to Mao because of these slogans, and they could certainly be qualified as useful idiots. Of course, they were the first to be exterminated once he took over. In 1935, Mao made his famous statement, all power comes from the barrel of the gun. The new Constitution is not an old Constitution. The new Constitution is the barrel of the gun, my gun. And never more will a communist ever have to face someone else's gun because we'll confiscate all the guns. And the motto is, we win, you die. And of course, in the second phase that was common to all 5 or 6 of the communist takeovers was taking away all the guns. And almost invariably, within weeks, the killing field started without exception, whether it's China, Cuba, Nicaragua, Iran, or Venezuela. We had 400 employees, and we were doing very well. And of course, one night when I was there was an explosion, and apparently one of our utility buildings was blown up by one of Castro's people. And Bill Miller, our manager, came to me and said, rushed into me and said I had to leave immediately. So I flew out within a few hours, 5:40 in the morning, to Havana in a private plane. And when I got to Havana, there was a luncheon of all the useful idiots to a man and woman. The Garden Club of Havana were in favor of Castro, the darling Fidel, they called him. Tyrants that brought on communism by using the term democracy, free markets, and income redistribution, and land reform. The only land reform any of them ever provided was the land over which these useful idiots were buried. Captain, it's a great question because it was an aberration. Constantine Menges and I, he was on the National Security Council, and I was ambassador to the OAS, which included Grenada, and we took our request to the National Security Council on a Monday that we send in a carrier and Marines to throw Soviets and the Cubans out of the country out of Grenada because they had taken over through another tyrant named Maurice Bishop, and we were successful in convincing the National Security Council by Wednesday, after 3 hearings, that this should be done. And on Thursday, we were able to contact President Reagan, who was in Augusta, Georgia, and in a golf tournament. And when he was informed of our plan, he said, "Get it done," or words to that effect. And so by the weekend, we began the process of moving a carrier and with the Marines down to Grenada. And shortly thereafter, we landed and drove the Cubans after 5 or 6 days, and the Russians and the Soviets out. And that was the first setback for a communist takeover. A great leap forward. 45 million Chinese had died. The Museum of Communism in Washington estimates that under communism, over 100 million have died. It seems like no one ever learns the lesson. Today, I see all sorts of evidence from people talking about taking away all the guns here. Nothing's different. Power state and land reform. They use all these buzzwords. They don't use the word income redistribution so much as they talk about, we're going to give you everything free, which is more or less the same thing. For example, free college tuition, or we're going to give you a free medical care and what have you. I think if you asked me right now, after 100 years observing different movements in America and around the world, with hopefully a fresh eye in each case, I would say that this crowd today, using the term, they're standing for democracy and all that, are using the same buzzwords that I heard from these other 5 tyrants that I just described. In the 5 cases of communism, it turns out the term democracy in their terms meant communism in their terms. So let's hope this crowd, even though they're extremely far left, has taken over our country now, is going to be respectful of our Constitution, but you can't always count on it because there's so many attacks on our Constitution already from them, such as the Supreme Court, and talking about increasing the number of states to include more Democrat supporters.
What are your thoughts on this topic with regards to when you hear people today talk about regulating disinformation or misinformation in freedom of speech?
That's exactly what I heard in all the other 5 takeovers. And so, of course, you can't relate what you hear today from our own politicians to these terrible despots that took over these 5 countries, because that would be unfair. But I just say that there are certain similarities that I hear today that are not dissimilar. Well, when I was appointed head of the Navy as secretary, I took my job very literally to recruit, maintain, and operate the Navy. The Chief of Naval Operations, who was my partner in everything, 73, when I took over the job, that the country was reeling from the Vietnam War and was looking for a peace dividend. And they were talking about cutting the Army and Air Force and the Navy. And already the Navy was being depleted. In order to have peace through strength, resolved in 1974 to rebuild the Navy in a major way, and we created the Ohio-class Trident missile submarine force, which is still to this day the backbone of our nuclear deterrence, with a large percentage of all of our nuclear weapons aboard the Trident missiles. Those missiles, and we also developed the Aegis missile system, and we put it on top of the 80 or so Arleigh Burke destroyers, which are now our main surface combatant force of the U.S. Navy. 50 years later, I had no idea they'd be around 50 years later, but as part of our backbone of our defense 50 years later. But it's I'm very, of course, I take a certain small satisfaction in knowing that they do. One of the reasons why the president and the administration today named a ship after me recently was because of the long lifetime of our overwhelming peace through strength programs of the 70s. The only survival potential this nation has is peace through strength. Beware of anyone who says that his great purpose in life is to create democracy when he means communism. You have to be able to translate these. When a far left politician says that he or she alone stands for democracy, put your hand on your wallet. After so many years, we find ourselves far outnumbered in commercial shipbuilding by the Chinese, and we have so much distance to make up, and he's been working on that, and he's farsighted on that. Yes. And also ship repair. We probably, when you consider the threat today from the Chinese and the Russians, and the Iranians, the North Koreans combined. United States has never, and now we have a sort of a vacant White House. United States has never threatened a bigger threat to its survival. And I think in the next 4 months, it's not impossible that we'll be tested.
Thank you for taking the time to hear from a Cold War warrior and leader instrumental in the peaceful conclusion of that dangerous competition with the Soviet Union. As our nation once again enters into a dangerous time of strategic competition, we must confront not one but several rivals. China is perhaps a threat unlike any we have confronted in our nation's history. The ambassador's wisdom is worth heeding as we enter the new Cold War.